there are clearly growing concerns that the United States is, in the medium term, not tomorrow, but really the path has been set, is really not a reliable defense or security partner, and that a new reality is beginning to emerge in Asia, and that's a very discomforting experience for those who became very comfortable with old realities, whether they're in Taipei or whether they're in Manila, or in fact whether they're in Seoul or Tokyo or Australia for that matter. Speaking of Australia, I'll just mention one more thing, and then I'll throw it back to you to sort of see where you want to take this conversation. As we all know, Australia, the United States, and the UK have been part of an agreement called AUKUS, the centerpiece of which is the acquisition of a number of American nuclear submarines. One of the other things that came out of the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore was an announcement by the Australian Defence Minister and Pete Hegseth that the previous terms of engagement on those submarines is going to be changed to a point where Australia will now receive possibly 3, they call them in-service vessels, also known as second-hand vessels, and that has set off quite a lively reaction in Australia about not just the submarines per se, but actually the entire framework upon which that submarines decision was originally made 4 or 5 years ago. And I think we are going to see an intensified public debate and potentially reckoning with this decision and what it actually means. Now, as part of all of that, a former Labor federal minister, Peter Garrett, who was also the lead singer of the rock band Midnight Oil, announced the formation of what I call a People's Commission or a Citizens Commission of Inquiry into AUKUS. Now, this is a very interesting development because I can't think in my own living memory of a precedent of something like this, a civil society, citizen-initiated commission of inquiry in lieu of parliamentary investigations and oversight, and there is every likelihood that this commission of inquiry will become a major focal point of not only critical reflection on the submarines decision, but actually on the much wider set of questions concerning Australian defence posture and the rationale or the framework of the ways in which Australia has, in recent times, say the last couple of decades in particular, arrived at its national security and defence priorities and decision making. So there's a little bit going on in our neck of the woods.
Well, I have a question about that deal. Why do you think they did that? I mean, original deal was for Australia to receive a brand new nuclear submarine sometime down the road, maybe 10 years, maybe 20 years, who knows? It all depends on the production capability of U.S. military-industrial complex. Why did they do this such announcement, which they must know would cause public scrutiny inside Australia? But why did they do that?
Because I don't think the Americans have either the capacity or the willingness to provide new submarines in any case. For the Americans to meet their own targeted numbers, they would need to be able to manufacture 2.3 new Virginia-class submarines per year. Right now, the annual average production rate is around 1.2, 1.3. So they are well short, almost half of the capacity that the Americans themselves need to be for their own needs. So the chances that the Americans were ever going to provide submarines out of their own allocations to a third party was next to well, next to improbable, right? And in fact, one of the conditions of the original agreement was that the provision of these submarines was always going to be subject to the decision of the president at the time, that the submarines being provided to Australia did not compromise America's own requirements. So there's always been this possibility or risk, depending on what perspective you have on this, that the submarines were never, ever going to be made available to Australia in any case. And that, of course, has been one of the principal criticisms of the entire arrangement at an operational level, at least. Put aside the strategic questions of whether, in fact, the submarines contribute meaningfully to Australian defence or to peace and security in the region. Just put that strategic question aside for half a moment. The idea that you would commit a national defence strategy to something that has an operational delivery risk as big as this seems to be a little bit foolhardy. And that was one of the early and sustained criticisms of the entire arrangement itself. Of course, Australia has been paying the invoices to assist the Americans in boosting their submarine production capabilities. Not to much effect, I might add, at this stage. And Australia has been financing the development of facilities in Australia to accommodate submarines in future, and also to accommodate literally American troops that will be based in Australia. So the Australian Commonwealth Government is financing the construction of housing for American military personnel when they're stationed in Australia. Much to the chagrin of many Australians, I might add, who are currently staring at a growing housing affordability crisis. So we have big questions around priorities. We have big questions around prudence and good judgment, both in an operational and a procurement sense, as well as in a strategic sense. Over the last 48 hours, there's been some Senate estimates committee hearings in Australia where representatives of the defence bureaucracy and the military force itself have been subject to some intense questioning by senators. And for those of your viewers who'd be interested in a little chuckle, they might want to have a look on social media for some of the footage from Senator Shoebridge, who has been leading the questioning of many of these personnel, because what it shows is that justifying this backtrack to second-hand, 100% second-hand vessels has proven to be a very difficult justification. I mean, we had comments like it represents what was the turn of phrase? Something like constrained optimization, right? So 3 years ago, the first arrangement was described as the optimal path. Now, because we've changed it to this, second pathway, the obvious question is, well, if the first path was the optimal one, what does it say about this one? And the rationale now is that, it's still optimal, but it's constrained optimality. So we're starting to get this sort of Orwellian bureaucracies trying to weasel its way through this little logic problem that they've created for themselves. We've also got exposure that in fact the maintenance of these second-hand vessels, should they ever arrive, will be a, quote, sovereign responsibility of Australia. And a senator remarked that, what this basically means is that Australia is picking up some vessels that are in the tail end of their life, because you've got to remember they don't get refueled. They when the reactors expire, they expire, and you've got to deal with the waste thereafter. But in the meantime, there is not even a warranty from the manufacturer, right? So Australia's literally going to pick up, if these boats ever arrive, pick up responsibility for the nuclear submarines in the latter half of their lives, together with the responsibility for the disposal of waste, and the real questions I think that are starting to emerge go to, ultimately, how is it that this decision, it's a big decision, $400 billion decision, was made in the first place? and what sort of thinking went behind it, what sort of analysis went behind it, and it was based on the responses that we're seeing and the obfuscation and all of that. I think it's fair to say that at the moment, many thinking people are starting to say to themselves, I don't think there was much thought put into this at all. And if that's the case, then I would suggest that people would be right to wonder whether, in fact, Australia's national security is mostly being compromised by those charged with the responsibility of maintaining it.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a great deal for United States. I mean, U.S. essentially got a free nuclear submarine base at the courtesy of Australian taxpayers, and they get to pass off some of their old military stock.
Maybe.
Maybe. But Australian pay up front, right? I mean, like the money has been provided, so it's all good. It's up to Americans when at their own pleasure, at their own time schedule to give what they deem appropriate to the Australians.
So it's a great deal. It's a great deal for Washington, right? Because they're getting paid anyway. That's the first one. Secondly, they're getting bases to operate from. Thirdly, they're getting the accommodation for their personnel paid for. They get to decide whether or not and under what conditions the boats will even be provided. And in the end, they will be in charge of how these boats get used regardless. So it is a fantastic deal from Washington's point of view, which of course leads you to wonder, you know, it's not that it's a dud deal for Australia, because it is a dud deal. The question is, firstly, is how big is this dud deal? How much national security risk is actually created as a result of this? Because these are opportunity cost questions too, right? You've got to remember, by going down one path, you don't pursue other options. And those other options may actually have been far more sensible options from the point of view of being able to defend this large remote continent from very remote potential threats. But if you don't go down those paths and you go down this particular AUKUS path, then and you don't get any of this provisioning, and in fact the provisioning strategically arguably is not even the right kind of architecture for the defence of Australia anyway, then Australia is actually at greater risk as a result of this national security decision than it was before. We've reached a point where the technocrats are starting to worry that there's going to be a capabilities constraint or a capabilities gap for a period of time, which is between when the current submarines, the Collins-class submarines, basically need to get put out to pasture, and when these supposedly new second-hand submarines arrive to fill their space. Now, they perform very different functions. The Collins-class submarines are really designed for protecting the shallow waters around Australia, as opposed to these nuclear vessels. But the worry now is that there's going to be a time gap where there won't be any submarines at all. And so there's a program now to try to extend the life of these old Collins-class submarines for another 5 years, at great expense. And we're talking billions of dollars, hopefully to keep them on the road. It's like having a worn-out car, right, that you know should go to the scrap heap, and you are expecting another car to get delivered, and it's not. Right? And so you just band-aiding up the old car, hoping that it will get you through. That's really where we've gotten to now. There's a hope and a prayer that these decisions that were made in the last 5 years doesn't leave Australian national security compromised. I think it will. And that in fact, if these boats never arrive, then Australia has literally not only blown a bunch of financial resource, but it's blown 10 to 15 years of time to be able to do the things it needs to do to deliver, a secure and safe country for the people who live here. And that is the greatest abrogation of national governmental responsibility that I think anybody will have ever seen, if that in fact is what pans out.
There seems to be a shift in the U.S. strategy. Post World War II, there was a time when, as part of being a U.S. vassal or client state, you get to partake in the kind of the prosperity provided by the United States. But now U.S. seems to shift more of a extraction mode, to extracting a pound of flesh from all its so-called allies, or is that what you see happening? Okay.
Absolutely. The United States, for the best part of 4 or 5 decades, essentially provided a security umbrella and a prosperity well from which its allies were able to draw from, whether it was Japan and Australia and others. They had access to the American market. American capital would invest in their countries and build industries, etc., etc. In fact, the majority of Australia's largest publicly listed companies are actually majority owned by foreign shareholders, most of whom, by the way, are Americans, institutional investors in Australian publicly listed companies. So America already has, of course, or American capital has its fingers deeply enmeshed in the Australian economic system. But over the course of the last, a few years in particular, particularly since President Trump came back into office, the American political machinery has turned very much to an extractive mode, very desperately extractive. And I think it has 2 dimensions. One is the extraction of financial, personnel, and other resources from the assorted allies, client states, former colonies, sub-imperial allies, which Australia, I think, sees itself as. And it also is beginning to display an increasing amount of, and I mean the Americans, increasingly is much more candid and open about the extent to which it essentially lies to others. The idea that the United States today is agreement incapable, that you can't trust a word that comes out of the mouths of any American politician anymore. Many years ago, John Mearsheimer wrote, I think it was a paper, it might have been a book now, I can't remember, where he talked about, or he asked the question, why is it that political leaders, and he was speaking in particular about, those in the West, why is it that they don't lie on the international stage, but they lie consistently domestically, right? And the argument in part was something like, they don't lie internationally because the gravity of the issues involved means that international relations have to be able to be conducted in a way where the leaders can at least depend upon what is being said and what the word is. They will, of course, understand that it's not always the complete truth, but they're not straight up lies. Whereas, of course, in a domestic political contest, the idea that political leaders lie each and every day, is just part and parcel of how the game works. I don't think that particular set of propositions holds anymore, right? So, I think if John came back and revisited that question, he would now be asking, why is it that some Western political leaders not only lie to their domestic populations, but insist on lying to everyone else as well? And so I think the American character of 2026 is a combination of extraction and perfidy. Right? It basically engages in mistruths and misleading conduct vis-a-vis other nations, whilst at the same time seeking to extract its pound of flesh or its gallon of blood from its allies.